Okay, so again, this is aw10, and this is section 2.2. We're going to talk about bar graphs and histograms. So a bar graph can be used almost any time you can use a line graph. It's mostly just a visual difference. There is one key difference, is that you're not restricted to the axes like you were when it came to a bar graph, or a line graph. A line graph, most of the time you have to have your time variable on the bottom axis, whereas with a bar graph it could be either or, because this graph will give you the exact same data as this graph. That's kind of nice. The benefit of bar graphs is you can compare more than one thing at a time. So in our case here, we're going to have different grades, and we're going to compare the amount of exercise they do per hour, or per week. But we can also differentiate this into boys versus girls. So we can kind of add more results in a more compact space. Rather than having two different graphs, we can have the two graphs essentially on the one graph. So in our case here, we have boys and girls. I switched the colors because it'd be fun. And we're going to talk about the exercise per week. So if we look at just the grade 10s, we know that the boys do roughly 4 hours of exercise a week, and the girls do 5 hours of exercise. Grade 11s both do 4 equally, and in grade 12, we have the boys doing 6 hours, and the girls doing about 5.5. Again, when it comes to the graphs, you're going to be asked to be able to create a bar graph, as well as interpret data. So you can read this off, and you basically just read from left to right, where you look at it and say, okay, here's what it is. You must include some sort of legend that gives you an explanation what each color is or what each bar is. So if I'm dealing with boys, looking at the boys and say we know they're in grade 10 and they did 4 hours, you can kind of read pretty easily. Bar graphs, very similar to line graphs, and as far as graphing the data for it, it's not too bad. Histograms are kind of the new one, which a lot of people get histograms and bar graphs mixed up. The biggest difference with a histogram is it is a continuous data. That and the bars are connected. So whereas before we had a little gap in between those, in a histogram there should never be a gap. It should always be kind of touching. And you're usually comparing a large gap of information, not just a specific value. It gaps a range is probably the word I'm looking for. So for this situation, knowing how to read them is kind of key. So we have the number of kids by hundreds on our left hand side here, and we got the hours of TV. So you notice how it goes from 0 to 10. So we know that between 0 and 10 hours there is half of 100, so about 50 kids. Between 10 and 20 hours, it's not an exact number, but somewhere between there, we know there's about 150 kids. Between 20 to 30 hours a week, we have 100 kids. And between 30 to 40, we have 300 kids. So reading it isn't too bad. Graphing it takes a little bit more time, and just thinking out, setting up your axes correctly is probably the biggest difficulty. I even ask you the question here, hey, looking at the graph, looking at 50 kids, the first part, we know that they watch 0 to 10 hours a week. How many watched between 10 and 20? So you go to the 10 and 20, and again you go up, and you look right across. It would be 150. If you're given just data, so in our case here, please graph the number and weight of each fish caught. So this is looking at sort of a tournament situation where we have the different sizes of fish between 0 and 5, 6 to 10, 11 to 15, 16 to 20, and we have the number of fish caught in that range. So when I made my axes, I put the weight on the bottom and the number of fish on the left hand side. You technically could swap these. Your graph would just look kind of like we had at the beginning there. Everything would be on the side. So between 0 to 50, we know there was 20 fish caught. So there was 20 between 0 and 50. You could color that in, but I'm using Sharpies. Between 6 to 10, I should probably even say 5 to 10, we know there was 15 fish caught. Between 11 to 15, or 10 to 15, we know there were 7 fish caught. Now wasn't very nice to myself, so that's about 7 there. My light's turned off. There you go. And between 16 to 20, we know there was 3 fish caught. So that weird little histogram right there. So again, graphing it, it's really setting up your scales and your axes and making sure you have nice even points in between. You wouldn't go 5, 20, 30. You make sure it's nice and even all the way across. Same for both axes. That's really all there is information-wise for histograms and bar graphs. Most of this information you got last semester, a little bit of a refresher this semester. It's nothing too bad. So for your 2 questions, the first question is you have to, using a bar graph the following information, where we're basically going to have the favorite type of movies, and I've made all this information up. So we have comedy and the number, so we have the type of movie, and we have the how many students. So we have for comedy, we know that 4 students like comedy. For action, we had 10. Romance, we had 7. Drama, we had 3. And science fiction, we had 9, or sci-fi. For the second question, this is going to make you using a histogram. And we have the tree height, I should say tree. And we have the number of trees. So this is all in centimeters. So for the first range, we have 0 to 100 centimeters. We know there are 8 trees. From 101 to 200 centimeters, there were 12 trees. From 201 to 300 centimeters, there were 7 trees. And from 301 to 400 centimeters, we had 4 trees. Again, this is a bit of a shorter section. You'll find the whole graphing section isn't that long in comparison to some of the other ones, but it is good enough to give you guys something to start with. Good luck.